Welcome to the Mobile Security Show.
We're your co-hosts here at the Babbio Center on the campus of the Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. We're joined today by students, faculty, and tech professionals from around the New York metropolitan area. We'll be taking questions from them later in the evening, but first, let's meet our panel. We have Dr. Edward Amoroso, Chief Security Officer at AT&T, Dan Hoffman, Chief Mobile Security Evangelist at Juniper Networks, Christine Liebert, Senior Analyst for Security Services at IDC, and Charles Crouchman, Senior VP of Product and Delivery, Mformation. Welcome, everyone. Mobile apps, we download them by the billions, and sometimes along with them, dangerous vulnerabilities and malware. With new app stores cropping up everywhere, what can be done to secure the emerging app ecosystem? Let's start on the front end. Ed, how do you control what goes into an app store?
Control and apps don't go together. So the idea really at this point is that we're still kind of figuring out how to build some sort of control. I mean, right now, the answer is you don't. Right? You go on and you find things that are fun or potentially productive, and in the context of our discussion here, may have some security implications. So I think a new field is going to emerge around building controls on mobile apps.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Dan?
I would agree with that. I would also offer that when you look at trying to address the threats that's brought about by downloading applications, I think you have to take a very layered approach. I think controlling the applications as they're coming into the App Store is one way. I think service providers such as AT&T are certainly able to use their network capabilities and their security technologies to do that. I think you still need to have that endpoint client security on the device itself. And I think you also still need to educate users. So I think it's really a multifaceted approach to address the problem.
What do you think, Dino?
I think it's going to take I agree that it's going to take a very multifaceted approach. You have to look at things at multiple layers, and I think a lot of people are trying to be the ones that provide the security. Because with providing security, you also kind of enhance your brand and by protecting the users.
Mm-hmm. Now, my question is though, what are the benefits of using an open ecosystem? Why would someone use a closed version versus an open version?
Well, so it's an interesting counterpoint, because if you look at the two largest models in the marketplace, Apple has the closed model. Apple's goal is to sell more iOS devices. And so everything that they do around controlling what's in the App Store is all about how do I control the user's experience with more devices. If you look at Android, there are multiple App Store providers, each of which has a different goal for their App Store. Right? The hardware providers are trying to move hardware. The network providers are trying to provide value-added services on their network. And then there are independent providers who are just looking to get revenue from apps. So the answer is really it depends on who is providing the App Store. And with Apple, it's a very simple answer. But with Android, for example, it depends on whose App Store it is.
I can tell you from a service provider perspective, the closed model has a lot of advantages. Like it gives you the ability potentially to revoke something. If someone in the room here has an app that's kind of doing something on their phone, you can call the app, their handset manufacturer, call it service provider, somebody, but in that closed model, you might be able to get the thing revoked. As you open up, as you create alt app stores that could be essentially anything, a piece of malware on your phone, you go into your local retail store and say, I need help, and they're going to say, even know where you got that from, and there might not be much they can do. So there's a big difference.
Well, whose responsibility is it at that point? Is it the enterprise responsibility, or is it the person who's actually using the device at both home and at work?
It all depends, and it's one of the things that this community needs to figure out. Keep in mind, enterprise assumes you have a job. Most of the kids here don't have jobs, so there's no concept of enterprise. Hope you get one soon. But really, that distinction between enterprise and sort of an individual consumer is pretty blurred. So you can't always go to your IT department for help. It's a problem. It's one of the reasons why I think this panel is such an important topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but from an enterprise or business point of view, the endpoint or the device that's accessing the network isn't always under the network security infrastructure as your desktops are at the office. So making sure that those endpoints, the smartphones, iPads, laptops, are up to security policy with proper updated devices are really important to prevent any sort of malware, which apps are another vector for malware.
Are there different kinds of policies between something like a work-loaned laptop versus a work-loaned PDA?
Yeah, sure. So there's policies that enterprises can set, either whether they're doing it themselves or whether they're doing it through a service provider like AT&T, whereby they manage that policy depending upon the device and depending upon the user and depending upon the kind of application or data they're trying to download. So taking an approach that looks at all of those different things. In other words, like a laptop, for example, usually comes on the network once in a while to get patched and updated. iPad, not so much. And a smartphone, really, not so much. So then, taking a look at what the device is and setting policy around, well, I don't know exactly, this device might have gotten pinched from somebody and trying to gain access to the network. Well, that policy is perhaps not going to let a very sensitive piece of data get downloaded to it, for example, versus the laptop. So there's a lot of things they can do, but very often there's a lot of inconsistencies in how enterprises are deploying that, which is nice that I cover security services, vendors like AT&T, Verizon, IBM, HP, where they sell services, particularly in the enterprise community, where they're taking care of all that for them. IT staff is enough to do.
How much of a problem? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to add, I think it's an interesting dynamic too, because it depends on what you're trying to protect on whose device. So if you look at an enterprise device, a typical device that would be used in an enterprise, the consumer owns it. So being able to protect the enterprise data is absolutely important, and certainly nobody would dispute that. But that doesn't mean that the consumer aspect of the device doesn't need to be protected as well. So to give you an example, if I had just a virtual area of my device and I was protected while I accessed my Juniper email and so forth, that would be great. But what about when I'm doing my own personal banking, online banking, or financial transactions? I want that security to transcend not only enterprise security, but myself as a consumer as well.
When things are running through that enterprise pipeline, should someone who's using that device as their own personal device be concerned about their information flowing through that pipeline as well? Does it kind of work both ways?
Well, it does work both ways. I would be concerned about that, but I would be more concerned, and I think I would be a classic example of this type of user. It's my device that I own, but I absolutely use it for work use and corporate use, and I absolutely use it for personal use. I want it to be protected in both modes. So if I download an application for fun or entertainment, I want to know that it's not infected with anything. When I download an enterprise application, I want the same thing to be true. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky, but fortunately there are solutions to do that.
There's a problem, like fundamental thing. I know there's a lot of my students here, and I make them read Ken Thompson's paper, Reflections on Trusting Trust. And in that paper it basically says, if you didn't write every bit of the software, including all the build tools and maybe even all the hardware, then forget it. There's no way you can really trust what it's actually doing. So the idea that all of us, people in this room, everybody's got a smartphone with 20, 30, 50, 100 apps on it, and you don't know who wrote those things. You don't know where they came from. And the concept of just, I'm going to put them in a sandbox and test them to make sure they're okay is not good computer science, much less good computer security. So the bottom line here is that we are putting software on our devices from app stores where there really is no strong control around the integrity of what that thing's doing. And that is a fundamental issue that I think is not just computer security, but as I said, I think that's a computer science issue. That's something we need to solve.
And don't you think because these are personal devices, it becomes a lot, like the data we keep on those, a lot more intimate? You know, all of our communications, our personal communications, where we go, like our locations. So that makes like the risk to our own personal data even greater from a potentially malicious app.
How about just the credentials that you're typing in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, keystroke loggers on a mobile device, that's pretty scary, right? You have your Facebook account. You know, think of every account that you're tapping away into your mobile device to get access to. So even if you're sitting here thinking, I don't really store much on my phone, my contacts, Angry Birds, you know, whatever, who cares about that? Well, you do care about credentials, and I think that's a big point.
Some kind of Angry Birds like facade would make a very good keylogger app, I think, if you could trick it right.
First step, make an application as successful as Angry Birds.
There you go.
Well, that's actually a trend that we're seeing, truly, is we're seeing applications, some of them new, and people downloading them, some of them respected and trusted applications that have been pirated and malware injected into them. We see it a lot overseas, and of course security is a global problem. So we see it a lot in areas such as China where they don't really rely so much on, say, the Android market. The third-party sites are really more relevant. So they're downloading these applications that they think are well-known, that they think are respected, but they've been pirated and stuff with malicious applications.
Which brings up a good point. Like, how much responsibility does the App Store provider have to vet the applications for provenance, for security, for non-maliciousness, and things like this?
I would offer they do have at least a baseline responsibility to be able to do that, even if they're not vetting the applications, that have some means of communication or revocation or something to address the problem. But I don't think it stops there, and this comes back to my earlier thought about the multifaceted approach. I think it is the provider who actually needs to do that, but or the application store, as it were. But the provider is also the person who's going to get the phone call. So they're definitely going to want to have that on there. But it comes down to what would you do on your PC? How would you protect your PC? Well, you would install antivirus software or security software. Users have to use that same kind of context with their mobile devices as well.
Do you think it really comes down to the carrier at the end of the day? Because in my experience, if I was having an issue on my phone, for example, I would probably go right to Apple support or whatever Android app store I was using as my first point of contact for that. I don't know if I would go to AT&T. Is that something you're seeing?
Absolutely. I think that it's where you get your phone. It's the first point of contact. We're seeing that very much in the enterprise space and the professional space, where if you have a problem, I'm calling AT&T because that's who I got the phone from. It may have nothing to do with them, but that's who I know is my point of contact.
Your point around point of contact is probably very relevant if you, for example, bought a device directly from somebody like Apple. But if you bought a device from a number of other providers who don't have a direct retail presence or had significant online support presence, then your only point of contact is your carrier.
Do you see people going to their internal IT departments for help in that situation, or are they going right to the provider?
Well, in the enterprise context, they're absolutely they go to their IT department first, right? Because they think about it almost as a corporate device, even though it's a dual mode or a dual personality device. The consumers, it's interesting, there's so many layers. Is it the hardware manufacturer? Is it the provider of the OS? If those are two different people? Is it the network provider? Is it the creator of the application that I'm using? Or is it my corporate IT if I'm an enterprise? It's a complex question that's not yet settled.
I think that points to the issue that security is a shared responsibility. Everyone has a piece of the pie, basically. The carrier wants to make sure that their network is not harmed. The platform provider wants to make sure that their reputation is maintained. The application providers as well. And of course, the users and enterprise want to make sure that their data is protected.
But think about it. Let's say I gave anybody in here the job of checking out an app. What would you do? You would take the app and you would load it onto a device and you'd start pushing buttons, right? You'd push every button, every combination you could think of. Then you'd put it in some execution environment and see if it's spitting data somewhere, like sending stuff home or phoning out or whatever. And you'd watch it a little bit, and if by pushing the buttons you convince yourself it doesn't seem to be doing anything, and I run it for a little while and it doesn't seem to be mailing anything out, you take your good housekeeping seal, you say it's good, and anybody in here who's done software engineering for 10 minutes knows that's a pretty poor kind of way to test
just because
something.
It's behaving now.
You don't have source code. You don't really have much to play with. Even if you did have source code, you'd have trouble. So it's more than just, hey, we all need to get ourselves together and decide who's responsible. It is shared. I agree with everything the folks on the panel are saying, but I think it's deeper than that. I think that app security is something that reminds me, for those people in here who maybe remember floppies and computers. Remember computer security was just don't put a dirty floppy in your PC. What's an app store? It's a bunch of floppies, right? And not only we put it on our device, we just blindly push on something. I want that, and you buy stuff. Yeah. If it's free, you buy it to try it for 2 seconds, and then you get rid of it.
And the implications for the enterprise is huge, because if the piece of malware gets on one of these devices and unauthorized access back to the network, we're talking about intellectual property loss. And with compliance mandates dictating that the data protection, the requirements around that, they're subject to any sort of fines or regulatory mandates around that. Plus, the loss of intellectual property. There's one example of a bus company in Germany recently I heard, and there's thousands of examples, where they lost their R&D to a Chinese firm out of China, and they produced the bus at 1/3 of the cost. And along with it went all of their target market as well. So, we're talking, and that company, I don't need to tell you where that company is right now. So, it applies to not necessarily large companies, but also small companies. A small vendor there's a microwave tower vendor that we spoke to who was concerned about intellectual property loss. He had a little niche market that he wanted to maintain. He didn't want anybody to steal his ideas and his plans. So, it's big implications all across the board.
I would also offer that when the typical end user would contact the IT department, initially, they got their new iPad or they got their new full Android device. It's not for security, it's, hey, how do I connect my email to this? Mm-hmm. So that starts a conversation that may lead to just understanding how to connect email or take it a little bit further, such as securing the device. From my direct experience, the latter of really having that security discussion and also the tools in place to be able to address that is something that's really just coming to maturation right now.
All right, well, great points all around. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, how to keep the apps you already own from becoming targets. Welcome back. Quick, how many mobile apps have you downloaded this year? Even if you're confident they were clean when you got them, a hacker like Dino, for example, might be able to target them right now. So Dan, what do we need to do to make sure that the apps that we already have are secure when we install them?
Well, secure when you install them, you're going to want to analyze it during installation, but also have an ongoing analysis of the application. And to me, that alludes to a couple of different things. One would be that endpoint client security that's on the device, making sure that the applications are performing in a manner that it should, that it's not malicious, that what we've seen as a trend, not downloading an update that then makes it become malicious. Not as though you're attacking the application, it's just updating itself to become malicious. I think you have to have that, and I think it's also a mix of the network part as well to see, well, where is this device connecting to? Is it connecting to known botnet controllers and known spyware servers and so forth? So I think it's really both of those facets.
So how would you know that, though? I know you said there were different ways of figuring that out, but just the average worker, working for a large corporation, how would they know when they were accidentally opening up security holes for their network?
Well, they would know if they did have the endpoint software on there, just as you would see it on your PC or your laptop where you downloaded something malicious or a security event occurred, you'd be notified by your security software application. What we haven't seen to this point is widespread use of mobile device security software. That's changing dramatically, and will change dramatically over the course of the next, I would offer 4 to 8 quarters. And that's really where they're going to get the primary notification.
And then, what are you seeing are the threats? What are they doing? Like, if there's a piece of malicious software on a phone, like, what does it do to the user?
There's 2 primary infectors that we see, and this data that I'm sharing is from our Global Threat Center. So this is from our direct customers. This isn't subjective. This is actual data that we see. And it comes down to 2 various types of threats. One is spyware, and one is premium SMS Trojans. By spyware means is that it's taking information from your device. Could be corporate email, could be SMS messages, could be your location, and it's sending it to somewhere else that's undesirable or unknown. That's one. And then the second would be premium SMS Trojans, where it's the equivalent of dialing a 900 number, where just by making that communication, you get charged a fee. Well, you download an application, unbeknownst to the end user, a premium SMS message is sent out, and then they can incur a fee of a couple dollars or what have you. And few people would notice it, but when it's done en masse, it could really be problematic.
Christine, what are the trends you're seeing on the enterprise side?
Well, as far as what Dan's talking about here, a really interesting thing that we're seeing and that AT&T is doing amongst a variety of other services vendors is taking a global view of malware and looking at it from a behavioral and a signature point of view. So in other words, to prevent zero-day attacks, they are looking at both malware from a signature, existing malware, and then malware that doesn't have signatures yet built for them. So they're taking a global view of endpoint network traffic and finding this anomalous activity, which would indicate malware, and then they're running it through their engines that they have internally along with human intelligence to determine if something is actually bad or not. And if it is, then they send the updates to all their managed devices and anything else that they own or they can update. So it's really a great way to offer some predictive security, which is the next phase of threat management.
Actually, it brings up a good point. How do you make sure that these devices are managed so you can apply this control? And I think this is a question that Charles might be able to help us out with.
Yeah, so particularly in the context of the enterprise. One of the base requirements that you have in order to bring that device onto the enterprise network is it has to become a managed device. So it has to be registered with the management software on the network so that the enterprise IT then has the ability to do something with that device, to address it, to manage it, to configure it, to provision it. So that's an absolute prereq. So as soon as you bring your device onto the enterprise network, you have to realize you're ceding individual rights right away. You're giving some control to your employer to manage that device on your behalf. And that's usually part and parcel of a data protection or a data usage policy that your corporation is likely to have.
So what kind of power does the enterprise have over the person using that device in terms of just the regular, use case?
Well, this is where the new trend for individual liable or bring your own devices is driving some new activity. In the past, when all the devices were corporate liable, the individual really had no rights in that device. Everything on it was owned by the corporation, including the device itself. And that was part and parcel of the usual enterprise security policy. With the new individual liable devices, it's a dual personality device. And while the corporation now has rights to control and manage the corporate assets on the device, they do not necessarily have rights to control and manage the personal assets on the device.
Yeah, I would offer there's two other players in the security dynamic right now too, and one is the service provider and the other is the device manufacturer. If you think about the intent of security, you want to protect data, but if you're a huge device manufacturer, you want to protect your brand. You don't want your devices being exploited, so they're starting to offer security. And also, if you think of the service provider, the biggest asset they have to protect is their network. And you think about protecting an enterprise LAN, well, a service provider network is a big network. You need to be able to manage the devices on that network to be able to provide security. So we're seeing as a trend, service providers saying we need to manage consumer devices, everyone's devices, provide a level of security so that we're not only protecting their data, but we're protecting our network as well.
From a carrier point of view, someone like AT&T is not only managing multiple devices on their network, but also their employees' internal network. So what's the point of view in that regard?
Well, it's the same type of thing. I would remind everybody that when you think back to the threats we saw in the early days of PC security, we were worried about pop-ups that made little funny things, like you'd open a virus and they would go, we'd go, oh my gosh, that's the security threat, right? So, while I think the intelligence around what we're seeing now is useful, it certainly helps us sort of gauge where we are in the life cycle, we should expect things that are a lot more intense than, what we've seen to date, whether it's enterprise or consumer, and I think we've all come to the conclusion that that's a blurred distinction. So I'd keep that in mind. What we see now is the early days of a deja vu all over again from PCs to mobiles.
Well, the line is definitely becoming blurred because people want to use their own devices and be able to just carry one device and take it with them wherever they go, both when they're at play and when they're in the office. They like that convenience. So how do you think...
Or if you're a hacker, then at play in the office is the same thing.
Exactly. Or, self-employed. How are companies dealing with that going forward? That's obviously becoming a huge trend and something that every company has to deal with now.
Yeah. Well, mobile security is the #1 driver for security spend in enterprises in 2010. 3 to 4, just throw another data point out, 3 to 4 employees are now mobile. So it's an issue that they're dealing with. They're finding there's inconsistencies, as I mentioned before, with managing and monitoring endpoints, and with Windows Mobile, BlackBerry, iOS. The challenge is, there's no one solution for all three of those and any other endpoint operating systems. So the challenge is to allow people for efficiency and productivity to be able to use these devices, but also then provide enough security threat management such that it doesn't have the implications we talked about earlier to the enterprise.
And mobile means a lot of different things now, too. It's not only just the handheld devices that we have, but it can also even mean, dialing in over a 3G data network on your laptop, too. There's all these different ways that you can connect to your internal network. All right, well, we're going to take another quick break, but when we come back, just how do you detect and defend against a malicious app? The answer is coming up next.
first of all, is we're seeing a reasonable amount of scanning activity on port 53.
They have now blocked an entire subdomain.
It's possible that someone would be able to remotely install an application on their handset.
iPhone has been pretty good in terms of keeping malware off of it. Android, not so much, and it seems to be picking up speed.
This attack is at layer 8. It's the human layer that you're attacking here.
Right. Thanks very much, and look forward to talking with you next time.
Christine, so far we've focused on preventing malicious apps from getting on your mobile device and protecting those apps once they're already installed. Mobile devices present additional challenges, though, to the enterprise. What are companies doing to prevent and detecting malware on mobile devices?
Well, first, making sure that those devices are up to security policy. So businesses set policy based on their requirements of how sensitive they are to how sensitive, whether they've got customer data that they're trying to prevent leaving the network, or depending upon if they're financial services or healthcare, if they're subject to particular compliance or industry mandates. So based on the security policy, then they can push that out to those mobile devices as well. But then once they can, there's a lot of technologies that enterprises deploy to determine whether there's bad traffic crossing across the network. And then the advanced technology we talked about earlier with the threat management and the predictive security elements. Determining if that traffic is crossing across the network, there's behavior-based tools such as security information management, security event management, where they can look at anomalous behavior based on baselining that network traffic, and then also the evidence of any viruses. Or
well, I wish people were doing that, right? I mean, it's three things that you say. Passwords, so I'm a CSO, so have good passwords on the device, and that's a good thing. You leave the device in a cab or something, and you hope it's not set to like 30 minutes, because if somebody grabs it, then it doesn't matter to change the password. Second is some sort of remote wipe, and as Dino and others would attest, that's a limited utility, right? There's certain conditions under which remote wipe is going to work. Like if you never visit a network again, then it's not going to be remotely wiped. And then the third is some kind of encryption. And that's all over the board in terms of requirements. Sometimes it's, they'll say you need to have the device natively encrypted, but you ask somebody what that really means, and it could mean a bunch of different things. So those are the canonical three requirements that you see over and over and over again, and it doesn't include inventorying what's on the device. It doesn't include having some feel for whether the device is phoning home. It doesn't determine whether or not the software you've got on the device matches the licenses that you pay for. There's a ump other requirements, but to date, to Christine's point, there is a policy, but it's pretty limited. I wish they were doing the behavioral stuff. That rocks, but hardly anybody does that.
So I want to open it up to all of you, actually. What about mitigation after detection? What's the next step?
So again, in the context of the enterprise, the first step is it has to be a managed device. If your IT department, if it's not registered as a managed device, there's nothing your IT department can do to get to it, to fix it, once it's determined that it's a compromised device. So that's the first requirement in order for this to happen. Once that's happened, as it's mentioned, there's some fairly straightforward functions that can be done on the device. I think one of the most significant things that we haven't seen yet, we have not yet seen anywhere near the volume of malware threats that we're likely to see. And as a result, what we're seeing is relatively infrequent operating system releases from the operating system vendors. We're going to see the volume of patches go up dramatically as these security threats start to become more frequent. And so one of the major requirements you're going to have is the device appropriately patched to the appropriate level to close the door on any known threats that have been patched through the OS. And that'll be one of the things that you'll be seeing, I think, probably in the next 12 months become a strict requirement as we start to see patch levels of mobile OS, not just annual releases of features.
And I think it comes down to a couple different types of applications. You have malicious, But then you have unwanted and undesired applications if you're an enterprise, just ones that wouldn't be appropriate for somebody to have on their phone. And you can handle them a little bit differently. I suppose the common thought would be, well, if there's a malicious application, just remove it. Well, it's really not that simple. If you look at some of the operating systems, you can just remove it.
Well, what if there's disagreement? What if the enterprise thinks it's an unwanted app, but the carrier may not? And what if they each have control over a user's device, and if they disagree, you might have some issues.
Absolutely. So what we're looking at, so if you look at that kind, that's a great point, because it gets into that, then somebody has to repurchase it, and there's all kinds of red tape around that. What it really comes down to tactically, I think, is disabling an application and saying, hey, it's disabled, and then it's enabled by somebody. But let's not lose sight of the point that just because an enterprise would want to do something, or a service provider wants to do it, means that they can't do it. If you look at some of the operating systems, you just aren't able to do some things. And that's where you really have to have this consortium between enterprise players, service providers, device manufacturers, operating system developers to enable that. The people who should have those controls have them, and the people who shouldn't should not.
Yeah. You may have already touched on this, Christine. Was there anything else you wanted to add in that regard?
Yeah, but also adding tighter policies around what can and can be accessed, what can and can be downloaded. Somebody was saying earlier when we were talking before the panel started that, we don't get to do anything we want anywhere we want anyway. So it's not as
Except
if...
hackers, they can.
Except Dino, yeah.
You can do what we want.
So the model shouldn't be much different for the business environment. Sure, we should have the opportunity to use devices to enhance our productivity and to make us more... to make work not quite, make it a little bit more useful to us outside of the office. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there are controls that I think we need to tighten up a little bit in the enterprise environment. Ed?
When there's an app on your phone, then 4 things have happened. The App Store proprietor decided that it was okay to put there. And that's an opportunity for control. Like there could be improved controls there. Second thing is that the service provider has deemed it okay. It runs and there aren't some blocks and there aren't some sort of control. But again, there's another opportunity for security. The third, in the context of enterprise, is that your IT team decided that it's okay for YouTube to be used in the enterprise or whatever, Facebook or whatever might be sort of on the fringes. And then fourth, the individual decided to actually download and use it. So there's 4 places where the controls could be strengthened, but in 2011 into 2012, all 4 of those are relatively weak in general. I know, we tend to be sort of exposed to the leading edge in many cases, so we see certain early adopters doing things, but the bulk of companies in all 4 of those areas not only don't do much, but they probably don't even care. In 2011, 2012. That'll change, but it's the truth now.
Well, I don't think I would want to work in a place that I couldn't watch Charlie Bit My Finger on my YouTube device. All right, well, I think you've given us a lot to consider. When we come back, we'll have questions from our audience and final thoughts from our panelists. Welcome back. It's time for the audience to weigh in on what it takes to secure the app ecosystem. So there should be someone going around with a microphone. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand, and we'll get over to you. Great, we got one. What's your name?
Hi. My name is Elias Pinto. I'm not a current but a past student of Dr. Amoroso's class. My question is pertaining to the enterprise ecosystem. I think, are we looking at the wrong place when we're looking at apps and policies when employers are sometimes either asking or expecting that we are bringing our Android or iPhone devices to the office for that dual purpose? Are we looking in the wrong place? Should we be looking at virtualized sandboxes, secure sandboxes? A lot of desktop implementations are going that way, where you have a virtual machine that does what you do for your job. Should companies be considering that for cross-platform security, whether it is information access or even external vector from within another application, that secure environment? Should we be looking at virtual machines within that mobile device?
I'll let Dan take that one.
Yeah, the answer is yes, but we can't leave it there. The reason being, if you look at what that's going to protect against, it's primarily going to protect against loss and theft meaning that if the device is lost or stolen, there's nothing on there, so don't worry about it. It doesn't really protect against malware, okay? So if you have spyware on the machine or a keylogger or so forth, what you type can be intercepted on there. So without question, the security industry is moving towards virtualization. It should be. It makes sense, but it's just one piece of the puzzle. You still need to supplement with other security needs.
Right, what that means is that for the partition that is enterprise managed, the policies to be applied have no restrictions. You don't have to worry about bleeding over into the personal use of the device. So they can secure it more granularly and not worry about the personal data. But the rest of the problems, as you mentioned, do remain.
But is that realistic?
There's a big advantage to VDI or virtual desktop. One of them is that the underlying OS can be much simpler, and the less code, the better. The simpler, the better, and the less vulnerable to hackers like Dino, who want to drop malware into environments that the more complex, the better, right? I mean, the more software, the more unused utilities, the more just crap that's sitting there, the better the opportunity is to drop, keystroke loggers and things like that. So in addition to virtualizing, it'd be nice if clients became much more elegant in the way the OS is arranged. Less code, simpler stuff, and harder for Dino to go after.
Make my job harder.
That's all I want. I think in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right, do we have another question from the audience? Go ahead.
Yeah, we've heard a lot today about security, managing security from both a policy perspective, from a network perspective, a device perspective. You have after later on activities such as testing and wiping of applications if they are deemed to be malicious. What I'd like to do is focus a little bit more on changing the ecosystem in general to say, instead of security after the fact, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what are organizations doing or should be doing in order to empower the developers to build them securely from the first place.
Interesting question. So what should the companies be doing to help the developers make their whole network more secure, the platform that they're developing for more secure for enterprise?
There's two things you can do. I'm not sure everybody's doing them, but there's two things you can do, and sort of broadly speaking. One, you can incent them somehow to do that. So there's a bunch of things that come to mind, some practical, some probably not very practical. But certainly from an ecosystem perspective, if you want that kind of behavior, then collectively we need to incent it. The second is education and training. So even if I'm incented, it may be that I don't necessarily know how to do it. I thought Microsoft did a nice job in that second sort of category when Bill Gates announced some time ago that the Trusted Computing Initiative was going to be a priority. You could see, across their ecosystem how much better the code was coming out of the company. So I think, broadly speaking, those are the two categories. I wish I could tell you with some confidence that those were things that are priorities right now. Developer groups are starting to form, right? We see that a mobile developer community is starting to sort of coalesce. And security is one of the discussions, but most of the discussion is around functionality, utility, sales, revenue, app downloads, and that may not be the right sort of emphasis for the types of things that we're talking about here.
You bring up a good point. Users want secure applications. Enterprises want secure applications, but as Bruce Schneier says, it's very difficult to tell because good security looks just like bad security. So is there an opportunity here for the stores to basically give users, some indication on which apps are more secure than others or which have been built to some standard?
Yeah. You'd like to think that there was like some good housekeeping seal that you could put.
Or Underwriters Laboratories.
Yeah, and I think it would be more likely to be a seal that would talk to the development process. Like, it's sort of like if you show me somebody and ask me if they have a particular disease, I might have a hard time to tell you. But if you tell me what they've been doing the last 2 or 3 years, then that might be a better indicator of whether or not they have that disease or not. So I think that the software development life cycle, having greater transparency, having a little bit better indication of how the software life cycle is sort of carried out and followed and audited, what the credentials are of the individuals doing it, that probably matches the way our society works, right? Like you're about to have heart surgery. and you look up at the doctor, and what you would like to ask, you're probably a little groggy, but what you like to ask is, so how many of these have you done before, and where did you go to school? You know, those are two important questions, right? Software is probably the same sort of thing. You know, tell me the legacy of the developer and the process, and I can decide whether I want to use the thing or not.
It'll be interesting to see how it pans out. Let's take another question from the audience.
I heard a lot about enterprise security and that enterprises are starting to do a lot more in terms of managing their policies and stuff like that. But from a user perspective, a general, run-of-the-mill person that's going out and buying these phones, I'm still wondering how much protection there is from a user side. Where should the onus lie in terms of end user protection? Should it be the network being proactive and trying to detect bad traffic, or should OSs be trying to do more threat detection in their software, or is there some sort of existing antivirus software that is out there that's actually useful? I know there are a couple of apps, but how good are they for protecting the average consumer?
So I guess if the company is not stepping up to really proactively protect the device, what can users do to stop a problem before it even happens?
Well, I think they do need to take it upon themselves, and I would put the correlation this way, that I would imagine that nobody, certainly in this audience, would take their laptop, connect it to the internet, conduct online financial transactions and banking, and download all these applications without having antivirus software on your laptop. You just do, right? And hopefully personal firewall and otherwise. That same type of responsibility needs to be carried over to mobile devices. And you're going to start seeing that. It gets a little bit interesting, though, because now it's in this ecosystem of responsibility, it really is layered. People have less and less responsibility, and they keep putting responsibilities on others. So the banks have to become involved with it. The service provider needs to. The enterprise needs to be able to. But that consumer part of it needs to as well. And it's not just installing antivirus software. It's also a little bit about education as well. A real quick example is if you look at the Android operating system, which I'm a really big fan of, if you install an application, it'll tell you what permissions are going to be accessed. That's a great step, unless you're the 99% of the people who don't care and just click right through it, right? So it does need to be supplemented with technology, but that responsibility, unfortunately, I think is across the board.
I have a point on that one. If you look at an old movie, like a real old one, 30s, 40s kind of movie, electricity then was kind of dangerous. Like sometimes in like old Marx Brothers movies or something like that, you see like people getting big time electrocuted. It's like kind of funny. It doesn't look great. They're like actually being killed or something. But electricity got to the point now where over time, anyone in here wouldn't think twice about taking an expensive computer and walking up to a plug in any building, any random building, and if you were running out of power, you'd pop it in and be pretty confident that everything would be just fine. Wouldn't think twice about, hey, am I going to damage my machine? And the reason that is because we virtualized a set of protections that we can all depend on. And I think right now networks are like that. Like it's like 1930 with electricity. You connect your computer to Wi-Fi and who knows what's going to happen. Or you do anything online, you're really not sure. I have a feeling 30, 40, 50 years down the road, and some of you will still be, in your careers, I'll be off planting my garden. But, at that point, I think that we'll get to, a situation where the end user, you just won't think about it. You'll connect to a network. There'll be protections there, filters there. It'll all be virtualized, and it just won't be an issue.
Well, that would be
We'll
awesome,
just have to wait 3 decades.
to get there. All right, we have time for one more question, I believe, if anyone has one. Got the mic running around here. Go ahead.
This was a continuation of the last question, and also what Dan said earlier about antivirus and how it's going to step up in 4 to 8 quarters. Do you think the major antivirus corporations right now will start making a mobile antivirus? And also, do you think it's going to get to the point where it's like currently when you buy a new computer, first thing you do is install an antivirus, install your firewall, install all your security protections before you even put anything on it?
Sure. I think it's going to be, firstly, I think the device manufacturer or the service provider, somebody's going to have the baseline security on the device to answer your first part of the question there. And then in terms of, are the PC kind of vendors going to step up? The answer is yes, and many of them are. But enterprises are going to look at it from the perspective of an ecosystem. Not just do you have anti-malware, but are you going to be able to have the connection back into my enterprise? Are you going to be able to connect that edge of that enterprise? Are you going to be able to protect the core of my enterprise and so forth? And how does that play into an ecosystem? And I think that's where the legacy companies are going to fail, and where more proactive companies are going to be successful.
Charles, what do you think?
Well, there's a difference, again, between enterprise and consumer. Make no mistake, in the consumer context, the individual holds the responsibility, right? Nobody's looking out for you. They don't have a legal obligation or a moral obligation. They do have a commercial obligation. If you don't like this, if you don't like the service that you get, if that particular device or that particular OS over time is known to be less secure, people will vote with their wallets in the same way that they do with network service. So in the consumer context, nobody has an obligation to look out for you. The responsibility is with the individual, right? In the context of, and then so it's up to you to decide whether you're going to install anti-malware and those sorts of utilities. In the context of the enterprise, again, it's different. As soon as you put your device on an enterprise network, chances are you're going to sign some kind of a corporate policy, a data protection, data usage, appropriate use policy that cedes some of that control to the enterprise. And now they're going to take some of that responsibility on your behalf. And then you will see, I think, for sure, default applications installed for security.
We'd like to thank everyone for their questions. I think we brought up some very interesting points. And overall, the mobile security space is brand new. This gives us a lot of new opportunities and a lot of new security challenges. And it allows us to reevaluate a lot of the things that have already been settled in the desktop space. For instance, we no longer download software from a bunch of different sources. They're from centralized stores. And that gives new opportunities for security provided at different layers. And in addition, every device has an always-on data connection, which allows many opportunities, but again, a lot more security control. So I think it's going to be a very interesting space to watch over the next several years.
Makes me just feel happy that I'm only responsible for my own phone. I don't have to worry about it too much. All right, thank you to all our panelists. Of course, we have Christine, Charles, Dan, and Ed. And a special thanks to our hosts here at the Stevens Institute of Technology. And, of course, our incredible audience. I'm Veronica Belmont.
And I'm Dino Zovi.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time for another edition of the Mobile Security Show.